And I love that kind of combination of physically being there and then that mental exercise going on simultaneously.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I don't normally have like serious other thoughts in my head, but I often, if I'm not listening to music, I have a song playing in my head.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Samaya's Base Camp here in Annecy, France. Today, we've got the fortune to have Colin Haley with us today, and thought we'd kind of spend a little bit of time to talk about some fun stuff and kind of what motivates him in climbing and how he approaches his approach to gear. So, Colin, do you want to just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are and where you came from.
Sure, yeah. I am originally from Seattle in the Northwest U.S., and that's where I grew up. That's where I learned to climb. That's where I was introduced to the mountains. Since about 9 years now, I've been mostly based in Chamonix in the French Alps, which is an absolute dream come true for me. It's a paradise for the things that I really like doing. And I love every kind of climbing and skiing, and I really mean that. I think there's a lot of people who are like, oh, I don't like bouldering or I don't like aid climbing. Honestly, I love every kind of climbing.
Cool.
I love every kind of skiing, from like dropping cliffs to cross-country skiing. I love it all. And
Nice.
definitely my focus is in alpine climbing, and usually highly technical alpine climbing. There are reasons why that really attracts me. But I think one of them is the fact that I do love every kind of climbing.
Mm-hmm.
And for doing alpine climbing, technical alpine climbing at a high level, it is really advantageous to be decently good at every kind of climbing because it involves every kind of climbing. And so for me, it's kind of a natural place to put my ambition, because since I like every kind of climbing and skiing, it's kind of a good fit.
Yeah.
So yeah, my focus is technical alpine climbing. I spend a lot of time in Patagonia. I've done a lot of climbing in Alaska and Canada, and to a smaller degree in the Himalaya.
Okay. Quick question. How about your top 3 favorite climbs you've done?
When you say favorite, you don't mean proudest.
Whatever you want. Whatever one.
Because I think it's a totally distinct answers.
Absolutely. You can pick whichever one you want.
Okay, it's not easy.
It's never easy.
I think in terms of my proudest 3 climbs, I'm going to list kind of 3.5.
Okay. No problem.
One I would mention is making the first solo ascent, and to date only solo ascent, of the Infinite Spur on Sultana, also known as Mount Foraker in Alaska. I think it was a very serious solo climb, and I think it fit very well my strengths and experience, and it's something I'm quite proud of. And I would also mention making the first solo ascent of Torre Eiger in Patagonia, which was also a project that I had in the back of my head for a number of years before doing it. And then the reason I said that I'll mention 3.5 climbs is because one of the defining climbs of my climbing career was making the first ascent of the Torre Traverse in Patagonia with Rollo Garibotti. And on that climb, it was anyways a climb I was very proud of, but it was more Rollo's accomplishment, and I was there more in a supporting role. And I went back 8 years later with Alex Honnold, and we made the second ascent of the Torre Traverse and did it in a single day, which was a big reduction in the time it took. And that's also an ascent I'm very proud of, and one in which I played a much more central role than the first ascent with Rollo. Anyway, so that's kind of cheating. I'm kind of counting
fine.
4, but whatever. Those are climbs I'm very proud of.
So those are all really amazing projects, like that's for sure. So how do you choose projects when you're looking for things to do? What are the criteria you're looking for? And again, we talked about this earlier, but for us, this discussion, it's about projects being something that's not something you're going to go out just to train on, or you're just going out for fun. Like, this is going to be something where you're going to be doing something a little bit maybe harder or beyond what you maybe feel capable of, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, for bigger climbing ambitions, I mean, I will say right off the bat that I changed my mind a lot. So, I mean, I definitely sometimes will go on a trip and then I'll come home and say, like, no, that's not the kind of climbing I want to focus on.
Yeah.
But then 9 months later, I'll be like, no, I do want to try that again. So I changed my mind a lot between different kinds of climbing ambitions. And I think for me personally, I view that as kind of a spectrum where on one end you have climbs typically at high altitude that are not necessarily that technically demanding, but very challenging in other ways because of high altitude, cold, etc., elevation gain. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have climbs that are very technically demanding, but not necessarily on the same scale, not as cold, etc. And where on that spectrum I want to put my ambition is something that I have a hard time choosing and like I fluctuate on a lot. And the difficulty is that you can't be simultaneously focused at opposite ends of the spectrum, because the more that you make yourself in really good fitness to go climb an 8,000 meter peak in fast style, the more you suck at hard rock climbing. And the more that you get in good shape for hard rock climbing and hard mixed climbing, the more you suck at going up an 8,000 meter peak really fast and light. Sure. So I kind of go back and forth on where on that spectrum I want to put my energy. And in terms of picking specific projects, I mean, I think first and foremost, it has to be a project that I will like enjoy trying in the moment. I think for me, it's always been important in all kinds of climbing ambitions and all kinds of even training that it has to be enjoyable for me, because I think if it weren't enjoyable, I would lose my motivation. But then on top of that, I think ideally, I like to find projects that fit my skill set well. I mean, even if I am pursuing something that I know will not see much recognition because it's not a famous mountain that people have heard of or whatever, it is satisfying and kind of special to do something that you know that very few people are capable of. And so things that fit my particular skill set are kind of appealing for that reason. Like, for instance, the climb I mentioned earlier, soloing the Infinite Spur, like that fit my particular skill set well because at the time I had a quite high level of cardio fitness and I had a high enough technical level to be able to free solo the climb, which is critical to be able to do it quickly and easily. And on top of that, I had already spent a lot of time climbing in the Central Alaska Range and learning the tactics and logistics and weather and all those things, which I think was also like a very important ingredient to that climb. So it's like, it's cool to find a climbing project that I know like fits me personally quite well.
That project had a lot of interesting problems to overcome, if I remember correct, reading the report on that. Did you not have issues with like getting enough water melted from the snow, or lots of different challenges in that space as well?
I mean, that climb in and of itself is a bit of a long story to tell the story properly, because it ended up being a very epic descent. I got, I would say that I got pretty unlucky with the way that the forecast drastically changed at the last minute and whatnot. But yeah, it ended up being a big epic. I'm nonetheless like very proud of how well I did the climb itself before it became epic and how well I dealt with the epic afterwards. But yeah, it is kind of a long story that was, I would say, still my most like epic experience I've ever had in the mountains.
It was definitely an interesting read for sure. So that's great. So when you're getting ready to do these different types of projects, how do you approach selecting all the gear that you're going to take? How do you, like, what's the philosophy that you're going to take behind like different projects when you're selecting things?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of gear philosophy, I mean, I guess I would say right off the bat that there's no formula, and like what is the best equipment for one individual might be very different than
course.
what is the best equipment for a different individual. And then that will also depend on what's the objective, what's the season, what's the current conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that if there's any like generalization that I can make about choosing gear, it's that there is no generalization, that everything depends on so many variables. And the only real generalization is to use your head to think about what makes sense in a given scenario.
Sure.
And I mean, on top of that, I'll say that I personally tweak out about climbing gear to very small level of detail, in part because if you really want to do things that are very challenging for you, it really does make a difference. And in part because I also enjoy that as one of the aspects and challenges of being an alpine climber. Because having the best equipment does actually affect the outcome, affect your comfort, affect your safety, all these things. I consider that to be part of the activity. And I've also always just been kind of a person who's interested in stuff, making things, modifying things. I mean, when I went to university, I spent the first part of my degree like working towards a engineering degree. And so I've just always been interested in this kind of stuff. And yeah, I find it makes a difference for me, and it also interests me. So I tweak out about gear a lot.
Yeah, I know.
And
that's great. So how do you balance that efficiency in the gear with kind of having the right gear for the situation? You know, a lot of times when we're thinking about alpine climbing, we're thinking about that balance between how light the equipment can be, and then is it going to be resistant, strong enough, durable enough? Is it going to, get by? Do I have enough margin of safety versus how much extra weight I might be taking along? Like, how do you approach that equation? Again, it's very conditions and climb dependent, but like, what's your like process? Like, what kind of questions are you asking yourself when you're thinking about that?
I mean, I think that basically everything else being equal, less weight is always better.
Okay.
Like, our physical performance carrying less weight is better. In addition to that, it's just way more fun.
Yeah.
I mean,
for sure.
I think everyone would agree that climbing with less weight hanging off your body feels nicer.
Absolutely.
But it is definitely an oversimplification to say like, oh, the goal is just to bring as little stuff as possible, because that's definitely not true. I think a lot of people, when they first kind of get into the spirit of trying to minimize the gear they bring, they view it in too extreme of a way. And so they're like, okay, the goal is just to bring the least stuff possible. And that's a mistake, because, maybe you can go climb, let's say the Walker Spur with your friend and belay every pitch and get by with just 6 cams, but that doesn't mean that it's a good idea. Like, because if you bring 12 cams, you might feel more comfortable climbing because you're less run out. You might spend less time thinking about, oh, can I place this piece here, or do I need to save it for higher up on this pitch? So, like, in general, everything else being equal, less weight is always better. But the goal isn't actually to bring the least weight possible. The goal is to bring the least weight possible while still trying to maximize other factors like safety, like efficiency. So it's all a balance. And I mean, I brought with me a handful of random gear that I like. Some of it is kind of like can be a good example of the type of trade-offs I'm talking about.
Absolutely perfect.
Like, for instance, and that's the main point, is that there's trade-offs to everything.
Absolutely.
Like, every gear choice is maximizing some quality at the expense of some other quality. And so, like, for instance, I brought 2 different crampons here. These are like the Dart from Petzl, like a highly technical crampon that is very good for ice climbing and mixed climbing. And this is the typical Dart, which has a steel front, a steel back, and a rigid center bar.
Yep.
And this one is the same front piece, but with an aluminum rear section and Dyneema cord connecting the two. And on any given pitch of hard ice or mixed climbing, this one will work better.
Right.
But this one is heavier and it doesn't collapse as small.
Right.
So if I'm doing a climb that is a 2,000 meter route of purely ice and mixed climbing, like say climbing Bagaya, also known as Mount Hunter by the North Buttress in Alaska, this is clearly the crampon to wear. It's like you're going to be doing a lot of hard ice climbing, hard mixed climbing, steep snow arêtes, and there's going to be ice fields of sustained 50-degree hard ice where being able to turn your foot to the side and having steel points in the back is very useful.
Sure.
On the other hand, in a place like El Chalten in Patagonia, there are a lot of climbs there, especially on the Torre group, where the climb is probably 70 or 75% hard rock climbing, but it's 25 to 30% ice and mixed climbing. Right. And so you need a highly technical crampon to be able to climb real pitches of ice and mixed. But for 70 or 75% of the climb, this crampon is just going to be in your backpack while you're trying to rock climb.
Right.
So in a scenario like that, it's worth sacrificing a little bit of performance for the ice and mixed climbing in order to have less weight on you while you're rock climbing. Sure. So it's like, it's always these trade-offs. Like on any given pitch of ice and mixed, this one will work better. Right. But depending on the scenario, you might be better off trading a little bit of performance in turn for a crampon that's lighter and more compact.
Right. So you're looking at like the amount of time it's going to be used and how critical that particular tool is for you to succeed on that particular climb.
Totally. Yeah. And like, I mean, it could be like maybe the pitch that you'll climb in this crampon is just as hard as like any of the pitches on the climb where you'll use this one. Right. But if it's one pitch instead of 30, then it's worth sacrificing that little bit of performance.
Yeah. And it's smaller in the pack, which means you can probably carry a smaller pack potentially, and that helps reduce everything and gets that sense of just having almost nothing with you. So
yeah.
Is there an example on the ground here of something like you had some input into kind of the development of and how it came about and where that kind of problem came from when you first saw it?
Definitely.
And how you brought that to the company to resolve?
Yeah. I mean, I with all of my main sponsors, I'm pretty involved in like the R&D side of things, which I really enjoy. And I think that different sponsored athletes contribute to their sponsors in different ways. And I don't give back to my sponsors in certain capacities as much as other athletes do, but I give back a lot in terms of product feedback and product development. This pant right here, up to this date, is the product that I have been the most involved in the development of. It's a Patagonia pant called the M10 Storm Pant. And it was basically, this started from me specifically asking the R&D department at Patagonia to make a pair of pants just for me to use for myself, because I was like, I have an idea in my head of what I want to use and it doesn't exist. And so it was originally just a selfish request of my own to get a pair of pants that I wanted. And I was very pleasantly surprised to see that enough people took interest in it that it eventually became a real product. But basically it's a lightweight, very simple hard shell pant, meaning like a pant with a waterproof breathable membrane, that has been optimized to not limit your mobility when you're climbing. And because for a long time, I think that most people felt that climbing in hard shell pants meant that you couldn't climb very well because it was hard to stem, it was hard to high step. And like what I realized is that doesn't really have anything to do with hard shell. It has to do with hard shell pants that aren't cut in the right way. Yeah. So basically, it's a hard shell pant that has been cut to give really excellent mobility. And in this case, the main trade-off is it's at the expense of fashion. They have this weird baggy look, and when I wear them, for instance, in the Teleferique in Chamonix, people are like, who is this stupid American wearing these stupid pants? Yeah. But they work incredibly well.
It looks very different than most of the Europeans probably, with very like trim profiled pants, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
and it's different silhouette.
Yeah, and it's kind of ironic actually that I very often will climb with these pants, which are like a fully waterproof, breathable pant, and my main shell jacket just being a Houdini,
Yep.
which is not a waterproof, breathable jacket. It's basically a windbreaker.
Yep.
And it's kind of ironic because I feel like it's much more typical that people have a soft shell pant and a hard shell jacket. So I'm doing
Yeah,
almost the inverse of what's typical. But to me, it makes perfect sense because my pants come in contact with the snow way more than my jacket does.
Got it.
Like sometimes you're belaying, half sitting in the snow, you're kneeling in the snow, things like that. And my jacket comes in contact with the snow much less. And, you know, some people listening might be like, well, what if it rains? Which is a very valid point. But most of the time in alpine climbing, I'm not really optimizing for what if it rains because these kind of full-on alpine climbs are usually done in below freezing temperatures. And so if it starts precipitating, it's usually snow, not rain. And so I'm not really worried about like total waterproofness. I'm more worried about like snow that's coming in contact with my body.
Yep. That makes total sense.
Let's see, what's another like kind of interesting example? I brought in a handful of pitons, which for adventurous alpine climbing, pitons are pretty important equipment. For like more normal alpine climbing, popular routes, often you don't need to carry any pitons because either they're totally not necessary or there's a bunch of pitons already in place, like in a place like the Alps. But for more adventurous alpine climbing, they're often very useful, if for nothing else, just as security. If you happen to need to rappel down some big face where there's no anchors, they could save your life.
Oh, absolutely.
And so what I brought here is a few examples of like extremely ultralight pitons. These ones are ultralight because they're made out of titanium. These ones are ultralight because this one happens to just be like a very optimized steel piton. These two are made out of aluminum, which is very difficult to find. I think these were left on Fitzroy by a Japanese expedition in the 80s.
Okay.
And I was lucky to become the owner of them. But so like these are pitons that are either extremely difficult to find or very expensive. So these pitons I would only bring on a climb that for me is kind of the ultimate, something that I want to absolutely optimize for, and I'm willing to potentially risk a bunch of money or difficult to find equipment to make it happen.
Yeah.
And for climbing that is like a little bit less my ultimate, this is like a selection of steel pitons that are much more affordable than this stuff, but still like way better than the typical generic pitons you see on the market. This is one made by Petzl that is advertised as only being for aid climbing because it's not really strong enough to be rated for catching big falls.
Sure.
Realistically, most of the time, you're way better off having this than
Nothing.
not a piton. And the other ones are all made by a small company in Slovenia.
Okay.
That you can just buy online from this small company in Slovenia, but most people don't know about. But they're way better than the like pitons from Black Diamond or Gravel or Camp. They're way lighter and they have a better shape.
It's good to know.
Slovenians are good at placing pitons, so they're experts in that stuff.
We'll have to leave the website if you want to share it with everybody in the comments. So, is there a piece of gear that you've used over the longest period of your career that you continue to use the same thing? Is there anything that hasn't really changed that much out of curiosity? Because gear changes so much so often. So,
yeah. Let me reflect quickly. I mean, there are probably a few examples that I could think of with enough time.
sure.
Among the gear that I brought in right in front of me, I would say that by far the piece of equipment that I've been using the longest is my iPod Shuffle.
Yeah.
I don't think this has been made for more than a decade.
Yeah.
And I'm not someone with any musical talent or any musical skill, but I really love music. And the combination of music and exercise, I would say, is my favorite drug. I just absolutely love it. Not for hard technical climbing, but for slogging, for approaching.
Yeah.
And even though today everyone has like wireless earbuds and all kinds of other fancy options, I actually still find that this little iPod Shuffle is the best system I can use in the mountains if I want to be listening to music on a approach or like while just like kicking steps up a long snow slope or something like that.
Is there a type of music you like to listen to in those moments? Do you have a style that you always listen to, or is it
kind of depends.
varies
So I actually
on
have
mood?
this iPod Shuffle, and I have also an old iPod Nano, which is about double the size of this, and then I have my phone.
Yeah.
And my phone has all my music,
Okay.
and the iPod Shuffle exclusively has high energy music for doing
Okay.
hard exercise.
There you go.
Whether that's metal or techno, mostly those genres.
Okay.
And then the iPod Nano is in between, so that if I go to the mountains for 3 days and I'm not carrying like my phone, for instance, it has music that I could listen to while doing hard exercise and music that I would still be psyched to listen to just like laying in my sleeping bag,
Yeah.
waiting to fall asleep or something.
Yeah.
So
is that
but
also-
this one is all high energy music.
Do you also find that's a way to kind of just pass the time when you're waiting out storms or anything like that? Is that something you also use in those moments, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially on like a expedition
Yeah.
where you have a lot of downtime in your tent. I listen to music a ton and audiobooks. I mean, anyone who's done expeditions knows that when you're in a tent for a long time, like reading a book actually gets to be kind of hard exercise. Because when you're sitting in
Oh,
a
yeah.
chair, it's easy. But when you're laying down
Yeah.
and you're holding the
Holding it
book,
up.
you alternate arms. You're like, fuck, my arm is tired.
Getting pumped out holding the book.
And audiobooks, you can just lay there and listen. It's great.
That's great. Well, earlier we were talking a little bit about kind of some of the challenges you have when you're climbing down in Patagonia, and I wanted to explore a little bit that idea of kind of why you like having the tent poles on the insides of the tent. So, for example, we talked about kind of high winds, but I thought that was an interesting kind of thought process to go through with kind of the listeners on that. Kind of how do you think about like the tent during when you're using it, and then when you're not using it, and the conditions that are out there for that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, having a lightweight bivouac tent with tents on the inside versus on external sleeves is a great example of something for which there's no right answer.
Right.
There's like significant benefits and trade-offs to both systems.
Yeah.
Like the tents externally is usually a little bit stronger and more stable in high winds. It also has the advantage that you can set up the tent with the tent completely closed, which is advantageous if it's dumping snow. And it also has the advantage that if the point of contact if the poles are like rubbing against a nearby rock, it's rubbing a piece of fabric that's not critical for the weatherproofness of the tent. So those are all advantages of external poles. However, the downsides of external poles is that when you're taking the tent down, you have to like push them from one side of the tent out, and it's much slower.
Okay.
And if you happen to be on a small ledge on a steep slope, that's even more problematic because you're pushing the pole away from you.
Right.
And if you're two people, you can be pushing the pole out, the other person can be taking it into their hands. But if you're by yourself, you're pushing the pole just into the void to fall down the mountain.
Yeah.
So that's a disadvantage to external poles.
Yeah.
The external pole system is also a little bit heavier because there's a little bit of added fabric. And one more reason why I like the internal pole system is that very often a climb that I'm trying to do is not necessarily a multi-day climb where I'm bringing the tent on the climb itself, but I need a lightweight tent because I have a long approach. But then I'm actually just bivouacking on the glacier at the base of the face and then waking up early in the morning to start some long climb that might even take 20 hours or something like that, getting back down to the glacier in the middle of the next night, super tired. And in those scenarios, I don't want to have to pack up my whole tent when I go start up the climb. I want to just like wake up, cram in some food and water, and then get going. And you don't want to leave the whole tent set up because in a lot of places in the high mountains, especially in a place like Patagonia, it's a lot of added liability to leave the tent fully set up because with the poles erected, it catches a lot of wind. And so a typical system is to just get up in the morning, get ready to go climbing, and then leave your sleeping bag unstuffed, leave your sleeping pad inflated, all that, but just take out the poles so that the tent lays flat and doesn't catch the wind. And then when you get back at the end of some long climb and you're super tired, all you have to do is like put the poles back in and your tent is ready to go otherwise.
Great.
And for doing that, it works much more easily with the internal pole system than with the poles in the sleeves.
Do you have to put anything on top of the fabric at all while you're out and about, or do you just let it sit there and
I mean,
maybe flap in the wind?
if you simply like take out the poles, it already is like way safer. People sometimes like throw some snow on top, or depending on where you are, like you could even put a rock on top, but you have to be very careful with that because if you put a rock on your tent and then the wind is like making the fabric flap, you can easily. What I've done sometimes is like if I brought a big backpack that I used for the approach, if I'm not sleeping on a glacier, I'll sometimes like put a couple heavy rocks in my backpack and then put that on top of the tent so that the thick fabric of the backpack protects the tent.
So you just opened up a good next kind of segment. Let's talk about backpacks. How do you choose packs for your different projects? Or what are the characteristics that you're looking for? Like, how do you approach your choice of packs?
Well, I mean, I'll say first of all that I own a lot of backpacks. In fact,
we all do.
Even my close friends poke fun at me for how many backpacks I have. And like more than that, I actually use on a semi-regular basis at least 10 different backpacks. So, you know, and it goes into what I was kind of talking about at first, that it's like, of course, someone could own one backpack and do everything with one backpack, and they'll be able to go climb mountains. No. It won't be optimal, but it's possible. But if you really want to optimize to do things that are really challenging for you, then you want the more ideal. And I guess for me, like always, everything else being equal, lighter weight is better. In addition, if it's a pack that I'm wearing while actually doing hard technical climbing, I want the backpack to not be very rigid. I want it to feel more like an article of clothing and less like a box against my body.
Yep.
I also want the backpack to not come up too high behind my head because especially when you're wearing a helmet, if you're wearing like a typical backpacking backpack, when you try to look up wearing a helmet, you can't. Yep. I don't know. So there's lots of little details that we could go into. But, you know, it's worth noting that a pack that is optimal for wearing while doing technical climbing will never be a pack that's very comfortable to wear while carrying a bunch of heavy weight on a long approach. And a pack that works very well and is very comfortable for carrying a bunch of weight on a long approach will never be a pack that is good for wearing while doing hard technical climbing.
Right.
So, like always, there's trade-offs. And for me, something that's very common is to go into the mountains with two backpacks.
Right.
You know, a big backpack to wear on the approach, which is usually not technical or not very technical. And so it's a big backpack that can comfortably carry a bunch of stuff. And then I have inside that a ultralight, very soft, very minimalist backpack of, you know, 25 or 30 liters that I'm going to bring on the actual climb itself. Sure. And obviously, all of this depends on what climb and everything.
Of course, but how much weight you're carrying.
Yeah.
What about food? What are your favorite things to eat when you're on a climb? Do you have set things that you always like to use? Do you have a style of type of food that that really works for you?
I mean, when I'm doing climbs here in the Alps, I love to take more real food, like, you know, a fresh, I mean, not, I know it's cliche in France, but I mean, a fresh baguette is unbeatable. But, you know, on a long expedition in a place like Pakistan or Alaska, bread is not an option. Right. You cannot bring bread on your climb there because you can't have a baguette from 6 weeks ago and have it still be good. Yeah. So then you have to climb with more like preserved things like bars and whatnot. And that's fine. I'm pretty used to it. But, I mean, when it comes to bars, I think variety counts for a lot. Yep. Like, it doesn't matter like how good of an energy bar someone has. Once you've eaten, you know, 150 of them, you get pretty darn tired of it. Yeah. I mean, one thing I'll say is that, like, I think for me, the harder the exercise is, I mean, in terms of like physical output. So if I'm trying to do something where I'm like working really hard cardiovascularly, the harder the exercise, the more I want pure carbohydrate as opposed to protein and fat. And also, the higher in altitude, the more I want pure carbohydrate as opposed to protein and fat. So for me, like the food that I would eat at a bivouac in Patagonia can like involve a fair amount of protein and fat, and that tastes good, and I think it's helpful. But for a bivouac at 6,500 meters, I kind of just want like something very simple, like rice with like a little bit of tomato sauce or something like that.
Okay.
So it's situation dependent.
How do you balance that time during the climb to keep moving and keep being efficient and, kind of getting some food in your system? Do you have kind of a rhythm that you try to stick to? Is there a pattern that you like to use of any sorts, or are you just opportunistic when it comes to that?
Kind of opportunistic. I mean, but it's true that not all the time in climbing, but usually on any kind of challenging alpine climb, you're usually in a race against the clock all the time.
Exactly.
And I'm not talking about records. I'm just talking about because you're trying to get up and down something with daylight, you're trying to beat a storm, etc. You're trying to beat warming temperatures. You're usually in a rush. And so, it's hard to like eat a sandwich in the middle of a climb where you're trying to move fast.
Right.
And bars work well for that because it's very compact. You can just like have one in your pocket. And especially in like very cold scenarios, like climbing in a place like Alaska, it's kind of like typical that in my backpack I have a stuff sack full of bars, and I keep one in a pocket in my jacket, and then as soon as I eat that one, I put a new bar in here so that by the time I'm ready to eat it, it's warmed up and it's softer. But it's kind of like I eat when I have the opportunity. If I have just led a pitch and I'm belaying the follower, I'm almost always using a belay device that for belaying the follower is auto-locking. Yep. So that's an opportunity where I can belay and eat a bar at the same time. Yep. Or just, whenever you have the time, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a piece of gear that you have been struggling trying to find a good solution for in all of your climbing? I mean, you work with lots of different companies, you work on lots of different gear, but is there a problem that you're just like, we still haven't figured that one out yet?
Well, I would say that ropes are kind of like, I would call like the last great problem in climbing gear, in that they are the only aspect of modern climbing gear that is still not 100% safe.
Okay.
The ropes today are amazing. They're like so much better than even what existed 25 years ago. Okay. But, you can be climbing on a brand new rope from like the best manufacturer in the business. And if you fall and get really unlucky with the rope going just behind the right sharp flake, the rope can cut and you can die. That still happens. It's like every other aspect of modern technical climbing gear is totally safe at this point. Like you don't just like freakishly break a carabiner. I mean, it does happen in certain scenarios, but not like one that you've counted your whole life on, And, ice screws don't just explode and whatnot. But you can still get unlucky and have your rope get cut. So I do think probably someday we'll have like well-performing, lightweight, dynamic climbing ropes that have largely eliminated that risk, but that hasn't happened yet. Okay. And I think another space where there's really room for improvement is stoves.
Okay.
And it depends on the type of climbing, but for multi-day climbing in cold environments where all of your water comes from melting snow and the whole environment is very cold, so like bringing any water to a high temperature requires a lot of energy and whatnot. Stoves are a pretty important part of the whole picture of what you take on a climb and what you use on a climb. And I think that the stoves that we have currently could be improved on a lot in terms of how well they work in cold conditions and how much energy you get out of them for their weight.
Yeah.
Like currently, the system that pretty much all high-level alpine climbers use is canisters of a mix of isobutane and propane.
Right.
And it works pretty well, but the canisters that we carry up these climbs are made out of steel, and they're actually pretty darn heavy.
Yeah.
And that canister itself doesn't serve any purpose other than holding that gas. And I don't think anyone's about to do this, but that canister could be made out of carbon fiber.
Okay.
you know, like, and there are also like other fuels that don't necessarily need to be a compressed gas, et cetera. There are other avenues, and it's just that the market isn't there. There's not enough people willing to spend enough money for a stove that's higher performing than what's available at the moment. But there is, I think, a big room for improvement.
I think
It's
that's
possible.
always the challenge with alpine climbing is the fact that there's a small number of total users and people that are out there doing that, and so it's hard for companies oftentimes to really want to address some of those very precise problems in that space. But
Yeah, and it's like, and that's when it's like a real
Yeah.
engineering problem. Also, you know,
absolutely.
stoves are not simple. So,
have you tried working on anything new yet?
you mean with stoves?
Stoves, yeah.
No, I mean, like, that's beyond the sort of thing that I can tinker on at home, at least with my skills and tools and knowledge. However, I have used heat exchangers
Yep.
a decent amount now, like a piece of either copper or aluminum, typically, both which are like quite good heat conductors, that goes from the flame of the stove down to the side of the canister. And, you know, it's a topic that stove manufacturers will never talk about because it's a big liability. Because if you do that when you're using your stove in 25 degrees Celsius in Yosemite Valley, it could be really dangerous, and someone could theoretically explode a canister.
Yeah.
When you're using your stove and it's minus 20 Celsius, the risk of exploding the canister becomes very small, obviously depending on the heat exchanger you've actually rigged up. And the added performance of your stove is remarkable.
Yep.
So it's the kind of thing that like will never be sold by a manufacturer for liability reasons.
Sure.
And most people will never take the time to set it up and figure it out because it does require being a bit crafty, thinking, testing, etc. But for those of us who are nerdy enough to deal with it, it does work really well.
So is there any pieces of gear that you buy and don't modify in your own way? 'Cause
Of course.
I mean, it's always fun to kind of modify everything. And I think you're kind of famous a little bit for modifying your gear. So are there specific examples where you're just like, no, this works just as is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very rare that there is a piece of gear that I wouldn't like make even some small change if I had the option to change its design in some minor way. But there is plenty of gear that I don't bother modifying because the way in which I would modify it is so minor, or I just don't have the means to modify it. But yeah, I do modify gear all the time. Like, here's a couple random examples. This is like a normal Petzl Sirocco climbing helmet. And the helmet has lots of ventilation holes in it, which most of the time is really appreciated because if it gets hot and sunny, you want your head to not be super hot and sweaty.
Sure.
But sometimes I'm climbing in places where it's just frickin' cold the whole time. And then you simply want as much insulation as possible. And one of the limiting factors for keeping yourself warm isn't actually weight so much as bulk and mobility. Because you could make an ultralight one-piece down suit that would really not weigh that much and be incredibly warm. But for doing hard climbing, it would never work very well.
No.
So often in these really cold scenarios, the goal is to stay warm enough while still being able to move well and climb well. And your helmet is on your head either way. And if it's full of ventilation holes, it adds negligible insulation. But if you close off the ventilation holes with some tape, and in this case I even added a little bit of closed cell foam on the inside of them, then suddenly your helmet, which is on your head no matter what, adds a bunch to your total insulation.
Nice.
So that's just like a random example of modification that for a very cold scenario makes perfect sense. But I wouldn't take this climbing in midsummer in Chamonix.
So how is it those ideas come about? Like, was it just like, hey, I'm feeling the cold air coming through, my head's cold, like what sparks a lot of that kind of drive to modify and change things? Because obviously you have an engineering background, so you have this kind of like sense of like looking at things and saying, how could it be better? But like, how does that come about in your mind?
I mean, I think for everything, it comes about from different experiences. But I think that's the main thing, is it comes about from experience. Sure. Like in alpine climbing in general, not just with gear, there's no substitute for experience. Like in terms of becoming a better climber, but also in terms of learning what gear works well for you and what doesn't. And in terms of like this modification, for instance, I think what originally made me think about this is that sometimes when you're climbing in winter conditions, like you'll be knocking some soft snow off from above you on a steep pitch of mixed climbing, and that snow falls down on you. And often these helmets, which are designed to also work very well in the summertime, have these vents, and then snow just like falls into those vents and stays there. Yep. And also if you are waterfall climbing, sometimes it's actually dripping water, and that just goes straight through the vents onto your hat or balaclava, which also isn't really optimal. Nope. So I think in terms of this modification, it was me noticing getting snow in these vents sometimes, or getting like water dripping in those vents, waterfall climbing, and thinking like, oh, like there would be an easy way to solve that.
Nice.
But I think for every little modification, it's something different that inspired it, but something that I experienced where I was like, oh, this is a little bit annoying for whatever reason. Like here's another random example. These crampons typically have a webbing strap here, and that webbing strap has a metal buckle that closes it, and it works great. But the metal buckle is a little bit slow, and as a result, Petzl came up with another system where the strap is not normal webbing, but it's elastic webbing with a plastic buckle, and that's much faster. But the plastic buckle has a tendency, when it gets frozen and packed with snow, especially in like spring snow conditions, it can get kind of frozen and then hard to open. And so I was just thinking about this, and I was like, oh, what could work better? And so I started rigging up this system that I've been using now for a little bit over a year, and I really like it, where I've replaced the webbing with just some elastic cord, and I have like a small accessory carabiner and a loop in the cord, and you know, this goes around my ankle and just clips in.
Static cord? Is it elastic?
No, it's elastic.
Elastic cord, okay.
Yeah, quite stretchy. Oh. And I've been using this system for a little bit more than a year now, and I really like it. And it's like I made a couple different versions. I think this one I made first, and this one has a larger accessory beaner, which you would think would make this the easier one to use, especially with thick gloves and whatnot. But actually, this is the easier one to use. Okay. The reason is that I realized it wasn't the size of the carabiner that mattered that much. It was the size of the elastic loop. This one has a very small loop. This one has a big loop. So this is kind of like the second. This is actually the third version of this that I've put together. But
so trial and error of sorts, right?
Yeah, and so basically the annoyance was that the plastic buckle on the elastic webbing was often hard to undo when it got frozen with snow, and that the normal version with the non-elastic webbing is a little bit slow to use. And so this system is fast to use, doesn't freeze, and as a bonus is also very lightweight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a piece or pieces that you find you're always taking every single time you go out to climb?
Almost always some kind of water bottle.
Yeah. What kind of water bottles do you like?
The water bottles I use most regularly are the Platypus by Cascade Designs. It's like a very simple water bladder. It is the lightest I've found, and I actually have like calculated with lots of different water bottles like the grams per capacity, and the Platypus is the lightest I've seen. But they're fast to drink from because it's a small opening. They're not crazy expensive. They do eventually fail when you've used them enough and bent them enough. And so for that reason, on a really important climb, I don't use my most well-used Platypuses. Sure. But on more day-to-day climbing, where a water bottle failure isn't a total critical mistake, I use the ones that are the most used until they eventually fail. The downside of those water bottles is that they have a small opening. And if you're filling up from a creek, it works great. If you're filling up from a faucet before going out to the mountains, it works great. If you are melting snow and then pouring from the stove to the water bottle, it's tricky. Okay. for that reason, I have a small collapsible silicone funnel that I found at Goodwill randomly one day.
Nice.
And it weighs extremely little, and then I can fill my platypus at a bivouac from the stove quite easily.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, so let's think about a typical day climbing in Patagonia. Your base camp's at the base. What do you carry in your pack up on the climb in general? Like, what are the things that you're always going to have with you think?
You mean aside from the rack and ropes?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. What's in the backpack?
I mean, first of all, I wouldn't say like the backpack because it depends on the climb.
Of course, you may not.
And like some climbs in Patagonia, the leader would have a very light pack and the follower a slightly heavier pack. In some scenarios, you would just have one pack between two people that the follower carries. But I mean, things that like on a typical day of doing a technical climb in Chaltén that would almost always be in the backpack or the backpacks would be water, food, clothing. And clothing is another thing where like the objective isn't to bring the absolute minimum to get by with. The objective is to bring the lightest system that is not only safe but comfortable. Because freezing your ass off for 8 hours straight like makes you climb worse, and you know, in addition to being a risk if you don't have like that margin. So yeah, food, water, clothing, sunglasses, perhaps multiple pairs of gloves. And I mean, the other thing that's very important to mention is a good headlamp, and usually with at least one, if not two or even three spare batteries.
Okay.
I actually, you know, growing up in North America, as you're familiar, people talk about the 10 essentials a lot of the time. And I don't even remember what the official list of the 10 essentials is, but it's a lot of things, and a lot of them I don't often carry. In my opinion, I often talk about the one essential, and it's headlamp.
Okay.
Because, I mean, that's actually, I think, one of the biggest gear advances in my climbing lifetime. I mean, headlamps already existed before my time, but LED headlamps came about while I was already a climber, and that was a big advancement. And I mean, I often think about climbers in like the 1930s and 40s climbing on the Eiger and the Jurass with no light. Yeah. And it's like it gets dark and they're like, okay, I guess we're stopping here. We're in whatever horrible, crappy place they happen to be in at that time. And today we have a huge advantage that we have lightweight, bright headlamps that can work for a long time.
Yep.
And I think, I call them the one essential because being without light when it's nighttime changes everything, and you basically cannot do anything except sit there until it's daytime again. But having a good headlamp, route finding is harder, but otherwise it's just like daytime.
Yep.
I mean, it's colder, but it's a completely different scenario being at night with a headlamp or without. And so, you know, I think very often when people end up having some epic and they have some unplanned bivouac where they shiver on a ledge all night, if they both had good headlamps, they would have just kept climbing, kept rappelling, whatever. And so, that's like, to me, the one essential is a good headlamp, and often with spare batteries. And it's also touches on a separate subject, and that's that I think that bivouacking is a quintessential part of alpine climbing, but to me, it's not the part that I like the most.
Yep.
And I think often people waste a lot of time and energy bivouacking in uncomfortable places when it would be more efficient to just put your headlamp on and keep climbing for another few hours, even if you're tired, even if you're dehydrated, etc., and then set up your bivouac in a vastly more comfortable place where you don't have to spend 5 hours chopping a ledge out of like really hard ice at 60 degrees, things like that. Like, as a random example, a couple years ago in Patagonia, I did a solo ascent of Chaltén, also known as Fitzroy, by the North Pillar. And it took me 3 days, but I only had one bivouac during the ascent because the first day of climbing, it got dark and I was still like several pitches below the good bivouac site. But where I was when it got dark, there's some crappy ledges, but there was no snow or ice, so I couldn't make water. And it doesn't make sense to stop there where I'm gonna barely get any good sleep and I'm just gonna get horribly dehydrated. It makes more sense to just put my headlamp on, keep climbing. And when I finally got to the good bivouac ledge, it was almost light. So I had done this massive first day, and when I got there, I was like super tired. And as a result, I spent a rest day on that ledge the next day, which is so bizarre in Patagonia, where weather windows are short and you're always trying to maximize. But then I was able to get a very early start on the third day and climb from there all the way to the summit.
Nice.
And so it sounds a little bit bizarre, but I think it was actually much more efficient than if I had stopped where it got dark on the first day and had a horrible bivouac. And then the second day I would have like climbed farther, but I would have been climbing slowly because I would have been destroyed from being dehydrated all night. And so things like that, like I think often people would be better off like postponing their bivouac to a better place and just climbing in the dark for a while longer.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, Colin, is there a climb that you've done sometime in your career and your time that you could look back at and say, I learned the most from that particular climb, and what do you think you learned from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think every time you go climbing, you learn things, even if it's not something that you can specifically put your finger on and summarize in a sentence. But I think if I were to pick a single climb where I learned the most, it would be fairly early in my climbing career, which shouldn't be surprising because when you have less experience, you're more likely to be learning a lot quickly. And when I was 17 years old, I was in that period doing a fair amount of winter climbing in the Cascades with a friend named Mark Bunker, who was one of my best climbing mentors. And climbing in the Cascades in winter, most people know almost nothing about it because very few people do it. And very few people do it because it's very hardcore. The Cascades in winter, it snows almost every single day. The days are short. The approaches are very long. And when I was 17, we did the second winter ascent of the northeast buttress of Mount Johannesburg, which is in the center of the North Cascades. And the climb itself is about like 1,500 meters, so it's a pretty significant size face. And we did it right over New Year's, which means really short days.
Yeah.
And we did it right during a period of horrendous weather, not because that makes any sense, but because I was in school and he had a job, and that's the days that we had off. And so this climb was a 5-day journey, and I think every single one of those 5 days, it snowed at least a foot. So we were basically climbing in a storm the entire time. And so as a result, finding protection was always really difficult because everything was plastered. Breaking trail was always really difficult. And, when the weather is like that stormy, every single bivouac, it doesn't matter what brand of sleeping bag you have. If you have a down sleeping bag, it just gets more and more frozen every bivvy. And so like by our last bivouac, my sleeping bag was basically just like a block of ice.
Oh, no.
And yeah, it was like an epic climb in a lot of ways. We had to like mitigate a lot of avalanche danger on the descent because it had been snowing so much. And I felt like I learned a ton from just that one climb because there were so many things that I'd never done before, such like an extreme environment that I hadn't been out for days on end in before.
Sure.
So I think if I were to pinpoint one climb when I learned the most, it was that one.
That's good. All right, so alpine climbing, we won't call it easy, right? It's not a vacation for a lot of people, right? There's a level of engagement, there's a level of physical exertion, there's a level of mental exertion with it all. So what's the intrinsic element that keeps you coming back and keeps you climbing and keeps you kind of going out there on these adventures?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that it's maybe a little bit ironic, but I think a big part of what keeps me going back is exactly the difficulties that you just mentioned. The fact that it is hard is a big part of the appeal. And I mean, I like a lot of things about alpine climbing. I like that it's very engaging both physically and mentally, not just one or the other. But I think the fact that alpine climbing is very difficult, it's often uncomfortable, it's often very stressful. In the moment, sometimes you feel like, oh, I would be so happy if I could be in a heated room or in a bed with a pizza.
Yeah.
And, people call it type 2 fun for that reason, in that when you look back on it, when you're back in a warm, safe place, you think that was awesome. But in the moment, you're like, what the hell am I doing here? But I honestly think that kind of hardship is a big part of what makes the experience rewarding, especially like the psychological stress of being in these scenarios where your safety is far from guaranteed. You can't just be like, okay, I quit, because you're on the middle of some climb on some huge mountain in a totally unforgiving environment, and getting home safely requires your full attention and your full effort to do that. And that is very stressful, without a doubt. But I think that going through those stressful scenarios gives you some kind of, obviously, feeling of accomplishment, but also it kind of helps you like appreciate how good modern life is in the day-to-day, and helps you not get kind of too bogged down from things that might stress you out otherwise. But it's almost like going through hardship can give you a little bit more of like a broader perspective of things that are worth your attention versus things that are maybe not really that important. It's almost like, I mean, I don't claim to be a very philosophical person, but as my very elemental understanding, Taoism is a lot about letting go and like not caring about things that aren't important. And I think that sometimes having been through like very stressful experiences in the mountains makes it easier to like adopt that mindset and not get stressed out by things that don't really matter to you. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
That sounds great. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, it's as you know, like everything that is philosophical and relates to, the emotional benefits that we get from an activity. It's real, but it's hard to express clearly in words.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming by and sitting with us today. We really appreciate your time, and hopefully everybody took away a little something from this, and hopefully we can have you back sometime.
My pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Colin.
Cheers.